Marissa Hall had never been late to a hearing in her life. It was a matter of pride for her to be on time, no matter the circumstances. But today, something had gone wrong. Her alarm didn't go off, her car broke down in the middle of the highway, and the phone call she had to make to a client became an unexpected lengthier conversation than she had planned. And now she was rushing into a courtroom where she knew the eyes of every observer would be on her. She could feel the heat rise in her chest as she pushed open the door to the courthouse. The judge was already seated at the front, his black robe sweeping the floor and his gaze stern as he observed her entrance. Marissa took a deep breath, adjusting her coat and walking up to the bench. She knew she couldn't afford to show any weakness, especially not today. The court clerk looked at her expectantly, and she quickly explained her situation, that she had been delayed due to unforeseen circumstances and that she sincerely apologized for her tardiness. Judge Blake, the presiding officer in this minor case, raised an eyebrow at her words, his expression unreadable, but she could tell something about her excuse had rubbed him the wrong way. He glanced down at his papers and then back at her, his sharp eyes never leaving her face, and there was a brief silence that seemed to hang in the air as if he was weighing whether to believe her or not. He leaned forward, placing his fingers together and staring at her over his glasses. Enns Hall, he began, his voice calm but unyielding. The court expects punctuality in all hearings, no matter the reason for a delay. And while I understand life happens, there are no excuses for wasting the time of the court. It seemed like a fair enough statement, but Marissa could feel the weight of his gaze, as if the words were not just about punctuality, but something deeper. She could feel the tension in her chest tightening. She had seen this kind of demeanor before. Judges like him, who didn't like to be challenged, didn't like to feel as if their authority was being questioned. I must impose a fine, he continued with no hesitation, a fine for your tardiness. I hope you understand the necessity of this measure. The words hit her like a punch in the stomach. Marissa had prepared herself for many things, but not for this. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words got stuck. She had seen it happen before. Clients in the same position who had tried to reason with him and had only found themselves dismissed even more forcefully. She stood silently for a moment, fighting the anger that threatened to rise up inside of her. It wasn't fair, she knew that, but she couldn't afford to let that show. Not now, not in front of the judge. She nodded and accepted the fine, though every fiber of her being screamed against it. She could feel the heat of humiliation creeping up her neck, but she didn't let it show on her face. The last thing she needed was for this man to think he had broken her. Thank you, she said, her voice cool and controlled, and she turned to leave the courtroom, feeling the eyes of the room follow her with a mix of curiosity and judgment. As she walked out of the courtroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a fine. It was a moment that would change everything. She didn't know how, but she could feel it deep in her gut that something had shifted. Something was about to happen that she hadn't seen coming. Weeks passed, and the fine faded into a distant memory. But Marissa couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left unresolved. She had returned to her work with the same determination as always, but that encounter with Judge Blake lingered like a shadow in the back of her mind. In the world of law, timing was everything, and she couldn't afford to let anything distract her, especially not a brief courtroom clash. Then came the case, the one that could change everything for her. It started with a phone call from her senior partner, a case involving one of the largest tech companies in the country and a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against a rival corporation. The stakes were high, and the client was influential. Marissa was told that she had been chosen to lead the team. Her heart skipped a beat as she took in the news. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for, the kind of case that could define her career. The days leading up to the trial were a whirlwind of meetings, late nights, poring over documents and preparing arguments that would leave nothing to chance. She dove headfirst into the work, confident in her skills, but aware of the immense pressure this case carried. There were moments when she questioned whether she was ready, but those doubts were quickly silenced by her determination to succeed. She knew that failure wasn't an option, not now. The day of the trial arrived with the usual courtroom rituals. The hum of anticipation filled the air as Marissa walked into the building, her briefcase in hand and her head held high. She couldn't afford to show any signs of weakness today, not with so much on the line. She met her colleagues in the lobby, and they exchanged brief words of encouragement. Before heading to the courtroom, Marissa could feel the weight of their eyes on her, but she wasn't fazed. She had faced tougher crowds than this. When she stepped into the courtroom and took her seat at the plaintiff's table, she was greeted with a familiar sight: lawyers from both sides seated around the room, but then her eyes landed on the one figure she had hoped she wouldn't see. Judge Blake was sitting at the front of the room, his expression as stern as ever and his gaze sweeping over the attorneys in the room before finally settling on her. Marissa froze for a moment, her pulse quickening as her stomach sank. He was the presiding judge for this monumental case. She had expected many things, but not this. Judge Blake's presence was an unexpected complication, and as she stood to greet the court, she could feel the tension rising between them. He hadn't acknowledged their previous encounter, but Marissa could tell from the way his eyes lingered on her for just a second too long that he hadn't forgotten. Either the room seemed to shrink as she prepared to face him once again, only this time there would be no room for error, no way to walk away quietly from his judgment. The case began, and Marissa threw herself into the trial with all the expertise and confidence she could muster. Her team worked tirelessly to present a compelling argument against the opposing side, and Marissa expertly navigated the twists and turns of the proceedings. But with every ruling that came from Judge Blake's bench, she felt a chill run down her spine. His decisions, though not outright hostile, seemed to hold a certain weight that made her feel like she was being scrutinized at every turn. It wasn't just about the law anymore, it was about proving herself in front of a judge who had already made up his mind about her once and wasn't likely to forget it easily. The trial proceeded day after day, each one feeling like a slow and methodical battle. Marissa focused on every detail, every argument, every piece of evidence, making sure her case was airtight. But despite her best efforts, she couldn't shake the presence of Judge Blake. His eyes were always on her, his rulings more critical, his questions sharper. There were moments when she felt the sting of his gaze, as though his scrutiny was more personal than professional. She had to admit it, he was watching her closely, perhaps even with some measure of judgment that extended beyond the legalities of the case. The tension between them was palpable, though neither had addressed it outright. Judge Blake was never overt in his hostility, never openly questioned her abilities in front of the court, but Marissa could feel it in every decision he made. Small things that were just difficult enough to force her to work harder than usual. Rulings that took longer than necessary. Questions that seemed designed to test her patience rather than to clarify legal matters. It was a subtle kind of warfare, one that tested her ability to remain composed under pressure. During a recess, Marissa sat in her seat, flipping through her notes, her mind racing. She couldn't afford to let this affect her, not when everything she had worked for was on the line. But the more she thought about Judge Blake, the more she wondered if he was deliberately trying to undermine her. After all, this wasn't just any case. It was the kind of case that could define her career, and his actions felt like a personal challenge. As the trial resumed, Marissa noticed something else. Judge Blake's demeanor had changed, subtly but unmistakably. He wasn't as sharp as he had been in the beginning. He wasn't making as many difficult rulings, and his questions, while still probing, seemed less pointed. It was almost as if he were stepping back, allowing the case to unfold without interfering as much. Marissa couldn't decide whether this was a sign of his respect for her or if it was something else entirely. She had learned to trust her instincts in the courtroom, and right now they were telling her that something was shifting. She felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly followed by doubt. Was this change in behavior genuine, or was it just another tactical move on his part? She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Then came the moment that confirmed her suspicions. During a particularly heated exchange with the opposing counsel, the other side made a bold move, introducing a piece of evidence that could potentially derail Marissa's argument. The tension in the room was thick as she stood, trying to compose herself while mentally processing the implications of the evidence. Judge Blake, as always, sat quietly at the bench, watching her intently. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the courtroom, and Marissa saw something she hadn't expected, a glimmer of acknowledgement. It was subtle but unmistakable. He was watching her, not just as a lawyer, but as a person, someone who could rise to the challenge. His gaze softened for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, Marissa realized something she hadn't considered before. This wasn't just about her proving her case, it was about her proving herself to him. She took a deep breath, steadied her nerves, and faced the challenge head-on. The courtroom fell into a hushed silence as she stood, ready to respond. Whatever games Judge Blake had been playing, she wasn't going to let them interfere with her mission. She was here to win, and she wasn't going to let anyone, including him, distract her from that goal. The trial grew more intense as the days wore on, each side presenting evidence that added layers of complexity to the case. Marissa's team had been working tirelessly, uncovering key pieces of information and constructing a narrative that would dismantle the opposing side's argument. But as the trial entered its final phase, she began to feel a growing sense of unease. It wasn't just the high-stakes nature of the case that was troubling her. It was Judge Blake. His rulings, once seemingly neutral, were becoming more difficult to navigate. Every motion she filed, every objection she raised, was met with an extended pause, longer than necessary, and a pointed decision that seemed to favor the other side. The subtle undermining that had started in the early days of the trial had now escalated into something more. She began to wonder whether this was some kind of test, whether he was trying to push her to the edge, to see how far she would go before breaking. It wasn't just her entire team had started to feel it. A sense of uncertainty hung over them, as if they were walking on eggshells. The evidence they had painstakingly gathered was solid, yet the constant stream of small setbacks felt like they were being worn down. Each ruling that seemed to go against them had a ripple effect, requiring them to adjust their strategy and rework their approach. Marissa could see it in her team's eyes. They were starting to question whether they had the upper hand. But she knew she couldn't afford to show any sign of weakness. She had to keep her cool, no matter what. Then came a pivotal moment. During a particularly crucial exchange, the opposing counsel tried to introduce new evidence at the last minute, something Marissa hadn't anticipated. It wasn't exactly illegal, but it was a move designed to throw her off balance, to introduce confusion into the proceedings. As they presented it to the court, Marissa's heart skipped a beat. This was their moment to seize control, to make a bold move, and regain the initiative. But Judge Blake didn't help. Instead of ruling swiftly, he paused, stared at the documents with a furrowed brow, and then turned to Marissa with a glimmer of something in his eyes, something that felt almost like amusement. She could feel her blood pressure rising as she prepared to object, to push back against what felt like a cheap tactic designed to disrupt her case. But when the words finally came out of her mouth, they were more controlled than she expected. "Your Honor," she said, her voice firm but measured, "I object to the introduction of this evidence. It is irrelevant to the matter at hand and was not disclosed in a timely manner." For a brief moment, it felt like time had stopped. All eyes were on Judge Blake, waiting for his response. Marissa's team leaned forward, and the opposing counsel, sensing an opportunity, tried to make their case. The judge remained silent, his gaze lingering on Marissa for an uncomfortable length of time. She could feel his assessment of her, weighing her every word, calculating her every move. Finally, Judge Blake spoke, but it wasn't the ruling she expected. "I'm going to allow it," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "The evidence will be admitted into the record. Ms. Hall, you may continue." Marissa's jaw tightened. She had lost this round, but she wasn't about to let it derail everything she had worked for. It was a blow, no doubt, but she would recover. She would push forward. The court may have been playing games, but she wasn't about to be taken off track. As the trial continued, Marissa began to understand that this was more than just a legal battle. It was a battle of wills. Judge Blake was testing her, yes, but he was also showing her respect in his own way. He wanted to see how far she could go, how well she could handle the pressure. And if there was one thing Marissa was certain of, it was this: she wasn't going to back down. She was going to prove to him that she was more than capable of rising to the challenge. The power dynamic had shifted, but it wasn't over yet. The fight was just beginning. The courtroom was thick with tension as the trial entered its final stretch. Marissa had been preparing for the next phase of the proceedings, meticulously crafting her argument to counter the unexpected evidence Judge Blake had admitted into the record. But with each passing day, the pressure began to mount. Every ruling, every question, felt like a reminder that this trial was more than just about the case. It was about her proving herself to Judge Blake. It wasn't just the fine that had happened weeks earlier that still lingered between them. It was the underlying tension that had developed over the course of the trial. The subtle way he tested her, the way his rulings had felt like calculated moves to push her limits. Marissa had felt the challenge from the beginning, but now she was beginning to feel something else too, a deeper sense of discomfort that she couldn't ignore. Judge Blake was no longer just a judge. He had become her adversary in the courtroom in a way she hadn't expected. Sitting at her table, preparing for the next round of arguments, Marissa's thoughts began to swirl. How much longer could she let this dynamic continue without addressing it? She had worked tirelessly to stay professional, to stay focused on the case, but there was something about this tension that needed resolution. She wasn't just fighting for her client anymore. She was fighting for her own sense of justice, her own dignity in a courtroom where she felt unfairly judged. The moment arrived unexpectedly during a break in the trial, when the courtroom emptied out for a brief recess. Marissa remained seated at her table, reviewing her notes, when something within her snapped. The voice of reason in her head urged her to stay calm, to stay focused on the legal battle. But the reality of her situation hit her like a cold wave. This wasn't just about legal strategy. This was about whether she could walk out of this courtroom with her self-respect intact. Without thinking, she stood. She had made her decision. It was time to face Judge Blake head-on. Marissa walked toward the judge's bench with purpose, her footsteps echoing in the empty courtroom. As she approached, she caught his eyes, and for the first time, she saw something in his gaze, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even amusement, but also a challenge. She had his attention now. She took a deep breath and spoke. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and strong. "I believe it's in the best interest of this case, and for the sake of fairness, that you recuse yourself from this trial." The words hung in the air, unexpected and bold. She could feel the weight of the request bearing down on her, the silence growing thick as Judge Blake processed her words. He didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, Marissa wondered if she had made a mistake. But then, his eyes softened, just barely, and he leaned back in his chair, clearly weighing her proposal. She continued, her resolve hardening. "Given our history and the nature of your rulings, I feel it would be in the interest of justice for you to step aside. I'm asking this not for my benefit, but for the integrity of the case itself." The silence stretched on as Judge Blake sat motionless, his fingers steepled together, his eyes narrowing in thought. Marissa stood tall, her heart pounding in her chest, but she didn't flinch. This was the moment. She was taking control, and she wasn't going to back down. Finally, Judge Blake spoke, his voice low but firm. "Ms. Hall, I appreciate your candor," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. "But I will not recuse myself. I believe in my ability to remain impartial, and I am committed to seeing this trial through. What I will say is this. I am aware of the tension that has developed between us, and I assure you, I will do my utmost to ensure a fair and just outcome." The tension in the air seemed to dissipate, but it wasn't over. Judge Blake had not given her the recusal she had asked for, but his acknowledgement of their shared history signaled something else. A grudging respect, perhaps, but Marissa knew that it was up to her now. The court might have been under his watch, but the case was still in her hands. She nodded slowly, a mix of determination and relief washing over her. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said quietly. "I trust you will." As she turned to return to her table, Marissa felt a renewed sense of purpose. Judge Blake had not only refused to back down, but he had acknowledged the tension between them. Now, it was clear, this was no longer just about the law. This was about proving to both him and herself that she had what it took to see this case through to the end. And no matter what, she wasn't going to let him, or anyone, dictate the outcome of this trial. The days after Marissa's bold confrontation with Judge Blake felt different. The tension between them, though still palpable, seemed to have shifted. There was a quiet understanding now, an unspoken acknowledgement that the rules of engagement had changed. Marissa had demanded respect, and while Judge Blake hadn't granted her request to recuse himself, something in his demeanor had softened. The rulings, though still firm, were no longer as cutting. It was almost as if, by challenging him head-on, Marissa had earned the space to operate on her own terms. But the case was far from over, and the courtroom was a battlefield where no one could afford to rest. Each new day brought with it a fresh challenge, a new twist in the ongoing legal drama. Marissa's team was working overtime, finding holes in the defense's case and fine-tuning their strategy. But despite their efforts, Marissa could feel the pressure mounting. The trial was nearing its conclusion, and the final outcome was still uncertain. It was on the sixth day of the trial when things finally began to change in her favor. The opposing counsel had pushed a final piece of evidence, another desperate attempt to destabilize their position. But this time, Marissa was ready. The moment the defense team introduced it, she saw an opening. The evidence was damning at first glance, but Marissa had already done her homework. She knew exactly what they were trying to do. As the defense attorney began to explain the significance of the new evidence, Marissa stood up. She was calm but decisive, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Your Honor," she said, addressing Judge Blake directly, "I'd like to request that this evidence be excluded. It's been introduced too late in the trial, and the chain of custody has not been properly established. Furthermore, it's irrelevant to the matter at hand." For a moment, the courtroom fell silent. The defense attorney looked stunned, caught off guard by Marissa's swift objection. Judge Blake, too, seemed to hesitate, his gaze flicking from the defense to Marissa, as if weighing her words carefully. The room held its breath as the judge leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He was quiet for longer than usual, clearly deliberating. Marissa held her ground, her heart beating steadily as she waited for his ruling. The stakes were higher than ever. If she could get this evidence excluded, it could tip the scales in her favor. Finally, Judge Blake spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I'll allow the objection. The evidence will be excluded from the record." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Marissa felt a surge of relief flood through her. This was the break she needed. The defense's last-ditch attempt to discredit her case had failed, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, Marissa allowed herself a brief moment to feel a glimmer of hope. As the trial moved toward its final arguments, Marissa found herself facing a new challenge, one that had nothing to do with legal strategy. It was a personal reckoning. With the evidence now in her corner, she was on the verge of winning. But her victory wouldn't just be measured by the case's outcome. It would be measured by how she had handled the trial, how she had fought through the challenges, the obstacles, and the personal battles. Judge Blake, though still an adversary, had become a source of her determination. His silent approval had fueled her drive, and though she still didn't entirely understand him, she had come to realize that his tests had made her a stronger lawyer. She hadn't just survived this trial. She had grown in ways she hadn't expected. The closing arguments were fast approaching, and Marissa knew that this was it, the final push. She had come so far, and now, with the tide turning in her favor, she was ready to give everything she had to finish what she had started. As the courtroom settled into its final moments, Marissa stood tall, the weight of the trial on her shoulders, but her resolve unbroken. The moment of truth had arrived. The courtroom was quieter now, the air thick with anticipation as the final day of the trial arrived. Marissa sat at her desk, reviewing her closing arguments one last time. Her team was equally focused, each member quietly preparing for the moment when their work would be laid out for the judge's final decision. This was the moment she had been working for, the culmination of weeks of relentless preparation, sleepless nights, and countless hours spent analyzing every detail of the case. The tension in the room was palpable. This was the endgame, and nothing could be left to chance. Marissa took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. It wasn't just about presenting the facts anymore. It was about framing the story, about making the judge see the case from her perspective and understand why the ruling had to be in her favor. The stakes were enormous, and the pressure was something she had never felt before. She knew that if she faltered now, everything they had worked for would be in jeopardy. The defense was going to go hard in their closing statements. They would try to frame the evidence in a way that could still tilt the scales in their favor. But Marissa was ready. She had anticipated every argument, every potential loophole they might attempt to exploit. The recent victories, like getting the key evidence excluded, had given her the upper hand. But she knew she couldn't get complacent. Not now. As the defense team wrapped up their closing statements, Marissa stood up, her mind clear, her posture confident. She could feel Judge Blake's eyes on her, assessing every move, every word. He hadn't spoken much since the objection had been sustained, but his silence was loud. He was watching her, expecting her to make her final move. She began, her voice steady but powerful, cutting through the tension in the room. "Your Honor," Marissa began, locking eyes with Judge Blake. "This case is not just about facts or numbers. It's about accountability, integrity, and fairness. The evidence we've presented speaks for itself. My client has been wronged, and the facts are clear. The defense's attempts to distort the truth with late and irrelevant evidence are nothing but distractions. Distractions from the real issue at hand." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on her. Marissa knew this was her moment to drive the point home. She continued, carefully laying out the key arguments that painted the defense as manipulative, unethical, and desperate. The facts show that the defendant deliberately misrepresented the situation, damaging my client's reputation and business. We have presented not only the evidence, but the truth. It is time to correct that wrong. With each word, she could feel herself gaining more control. The arguments she had built over the past weeks were coming together perfectly. She had exposed the weaknesses in the defense's case and provided the judge with a clear path forward. Marissa didn't need to raise her voice to command attention. She simply spoke with a quiet, unwavering authority that demanded respect. Then she shifted her gaze slightly to Judge Blake. The weight of their unspoken history seemed to hang in the air, but in this moment, Marissa was no longer concerned with him as a figure of authority who might undermine her. She was speaking directly to him as an equal, asking him to look at the case through the lens of justice and fairness. "You, Your Honor, have the power to make a decision that will not only change the course of this case, but will set a precedent for accountability in business practices like this. My client deserves justice. The evidence has proven that," she concluded, her voice unwavering. There was a long pause. Judge Blake didn't immediately speak. The room felt heavy, the air charged with expectation. Marissa could see the subtle shift in his expression as he took in her words. It was the first time since the trial had started that he seemed genuinely contemplative. Marissa returned to her seat, the weight of her final words lingering in the room like a challenge. She had said everything she needed to say. Now it was up to Judge Blake to render his judgment. And as she sat there, waiting for the final ruling, she knew one thing. No matter the outcome, she had fought with everything she had. She had proven herself, not just to the judge, not just to the court, but to herself. And that, in the end, was what truly mattered. The courtroom was still. The weight of the past few days hung in the air, suffocating in its silence. Marissa sat motionless at her table, her eyes fixed on Judge Blake. His gavel was within reach, but the decision was still hanging, just out of grasp. She could feel the tension building with every passing second, the nerves from earlier in the trial replaced by something deeper, something more resolute. She had done everything she could. Now, all that was left was to wait. The defense attorney had finished his closing arguments, and Marissa had left nothing to chance in her own. She had put everything on the table, her strategy, her passion, her unwavering belief in her client's cause. The ball was now in Judge Blake's court. As the final moments of the trial stretched on, it felt like time itself had slowed. She knew this moment could define her career, how Judge Blake saw her now, how the world would perceive the outcome, all hinged on the next words he would speak. For a few more minutes, the room remained eerily silent. The clock on the wall ticked slowly. Its hands seemed to move in deliberate, agonizing increments. Marissa took a breath, her hands clenched into fists on the desk. She had to trust that she had done everything right, that her preparation and perseverance had spoken for themselves. Judge Blake leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the courtroom, then turning to the documents in front of him. Marissa couldn't read his expression. His face was a mask of concentration, as if he were still sorting through the final details of the case in his mind. It had been days since she had first seen him so closely engaged, and now the history between them seemed to culminate in this very moment. Finally, Judge Blake spoke, his voice steady, cutting through the silence. After careful consideration of the evidence, the arguments presented, and the conduct throughout this trial, I have reached my decision, he began, his words measured and deliberate. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff. A wave of relief crashed through Marissa, but she didn't allow herself to show it. This wasn't the time for outward emotion. The battle was over, but it was the quiet victory of those who had earned it. The defendant is hereby ordered to compensate the plaintiff for the damages incurred as a result of the wrongful actions proven during this trial. Judge Blake continued. Furthermore, the court strongly recommends that future legal proceedings involving similar behavior be handled with the utmost scrutiny to ensure fairness and accountability. Marissa felt a surge of pride fill her chest. She had won. Not just the case, but the respect she had fought for every step of the way. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, the weight of the verdict sinking in. The opposing counsel, stunned by the decision, quickly gathered their papers, but the case was already decided. Marissa's team exchanged quiet glances, relief, victory, and satisfaction all in one. They had done it. But as Marissa stood up to address the judge and prepare for the final steps of the proceedings, her gaze flicked toward Judge Blake. He was still sitting at the bench, his expression unchanged. There was something almost knowing in the way he looked at her, as if he had been watching her all along, not just as a lawyer, but as someone who had earned her place in this courtroom. As Marissa made her way toward the exit, she felt a sense of closure that she hadn't anticipated. The trial, the tension, the long days, it was all over. But what lingered in her mind wasn't the victory itself. It was the way she had changed throughout this experience. She had fought not only for her client, but for herself, proving her ability to handle the toughest challenges, even when the odds seemed impossible. As she walked out of the courtroom, Marissa knew one thing for sure. This victory, this moment of triumph, was hers, and it was only the beginning.